Right.
All right. So welcome everybody. If you are here to talk with Lawrence about his talk on knowledge management versus docs, and it's not really a competition between those two, is it? I hope not.
No.
So if that's what you're here to do, you're in the right place. If you haven't been to a candid conversation before, we truly want them to be a conversation. We truly want them to be informal. We encourage you to turn your cameras on, unmute yourself when you're ready to chat. Hope you have lots of good questions for Lawrence. He's a wealth of knowledge. I've had the pleasure of being on a couple talks with him, and I always enjoy his talk and also his perspective. He comes with a lot of great experience in the industry. And with that, Lawrence, it's all yours.
Great. Thank you. Thank you very much. So I had a recording that I made a couple of weeks ago about the differences between knowledge-based articles and documentation articles and community articles. And we spoke about those three different types. So what I'll do is I'll go through a very brief overview, first of all, of what that session was like, what it was about, and then I'll open it up to questions, and then anybody can feel free to unmute and ask themselves, okay? So as I said, three different types from three different use cases. One is from technical writing, one is from tech support, and one is crowdsourced or customer contributions. Okay, so the idea of product documentation, sometimes called zero-day documentation, which is a little bit dangerous, is a priori that basically you are there to inform people how the product should work. Okay, and it's usually quite structured, it's usually very nested, it's usually very hierarchical and very interrelated. And as a result, as part of finding your answer, it's really quite important to be able to navigate through that nestedness and to hold that together. And there are lots of ways of doing that, using tags and using tables of contents and using related links and things like that. Then we went on to support tech notes and how they are much more templated, that they are usually problem, cause, solution. And those are reactive because they are written by support people in order to address a common question that your customers are asking, right? And of course, those are usually very flat because they begin and end with the problem and its solution, right? So it's very flat, it's very self-contained. And so systems that are normally built for tech notes are normally flat databases with these single articles. You find the problem, you've got the solution, that's it, okay? And there's very little interrelatedness or connectedness going on. And if there is, it's quite shallow. Okay, usually collections are used with some kind of metadata. And then finally, we looked at community posts, and community posts kind of fill the gap between the documentation and the knowledge base articles, okay? Because they are when people contribute themselves to the knowledge by filling in those areas that haven't yet been addressed. And so when you're looking at all of these things together and they're swirling around and you're trying to understand where each one belongs, first thing to understand is that they are born for very different reasons and from very different places. But from a customer point of view, they just want their content, okay? They just are looking for an answer, okay? And so what you want to do is to try to find a solution where somebody could write in a question, and no matter where it was born, no matter how it was written or by whom it was written, because people don't really care, they just care about the answer, they want to be able to get their answer and they want to be able to get it where they stand. And so very often you have this, dilemma of, do I go to the knowledge base site? Do I go to the supports, to the community site, or do I go to the documentation portal? And the question that I posed, which I think is an interesting question, doesn't really have a direct answer, is do you want to try to bring everybody together to just a single site where all of that information is available, which seems like a reasonable solution? Or do you want to have people still maintain their different sites, but bring all the information to each of those sites? Now, about 5 years ago, everybody was talking about the single pane of glass. They wanted to bring everybody together into one place. But I think later on, people were understanding that having these separate silos or having these separate sites are quite important, and that you need to have a community site because that's where historically people have gone. And trying to direct people artificially into one central place hasn't often worked, sometimes because of politics inside an organization. And so people want the ownership of their own site for many different reasons. You may have these different sites. And so I proposed an idea of having all of those sites remain those sites, but making sure that all of the content appears in all of those sites. And that's really what that was talking about, trying to bring things together, acknowledging their differences. It's the classic melting pot, right? Acknowledging people's differences, acknowledging the differences of this content, but allowing the content to surface in these different places, all of the content, wherever it was born and however it was written. So that's a brief summary of the presentation that I made. So I guess it's time to open the floor up to questions that anybody may have about that.
So say, go ahead and mute yourselves and jump in with your questions.
Hey, Lawrence, this is Priya. Just a quick question. So we have the KB articles in our organization are pretty much maintained by support. And there seems to be a distinct disconnect there because they're setting out this information based on, just support cases that they get. And we've been trying to get a consolidation there. So, and like you mentioned, the KB article is pretty straightforward, right? Problem solution. And so we're trying to look at how we can start collaborating and get that information into the documentation. Okay. Not always, sometimes we put it in as a troubleshooting, and sometimes it really needs to be a part of, the actual feature explanation. So what's the best way to try and collaborate on things like that?
Right.
And how different should the two information blurbs be,
right.
From a problem solution to sticking it into the documentation?
Right, right. Okay, so there's lots, first of all, it's very much, thank you. So there's a lot going on in your question. So I'll try to break it apart and then let's see how it goes, okay? Having support documentation in the product documentation is one way that lots of people go. Technical writers have in the past written troubleshooting guides. This has been very common. And this kind of formalizes the whole process of KB articles to try to bring them into the product documentation, make them more formal. There is something about product documentation that is almost the formal voice of the company. It's the next thing after the marketing pages are the product documentation, because this is the voice of the company. So when you, I don't know, buy any product at all and it comes with the documentation, you don't think some poor technical writer was writing this in the dark. You think about the company and its voice. So it's an extremely formal way of writing. So bringing the troubleshooting documentation into the product documentation has a lot of ramifications. The first one is that people are sometimes very open about troubleshooting, and sometimes they are very coy or very shy or embarrassed about troubleshooting as a company. Why? Because product documentation ought to be saying how the product should work. It shouldn't be talking about how the product doesn't work, right? So when you have troubleshooting, it's focusing on where things start to go a little bit hairy on the edges. You know, things aren't quite as smooth as they should be. And that's extremely important. That allows for people to work around the problem, of course. But it also has an issue of opening up your shortcomings to your competitors. So there are some people who find that having the troubleshooting documentation with the product documentation is not so good. However, there are some people who definitely do that, and that's absolutely fine as well. So that's one issue going on here. Another issue is that there may be things that have been learned in support that just a small tip would enable customers to completely sidestep this problem. If you never push enter in this script, but instead you push shift enter, you'll solve all the problems. So instead of making a separate troubleshooting article, this could feed back nicely into documentation to say, as a little tip, don't push enter, push shift enter, and you're good to go. And this is just best practice, and off you go. And this is a nice way that support documentation can feed back into technical documentation using what are known as best practices, right? So best practices are often found after gathering mileage, right? So you get some mileage, people start to run the car, and then they find all kinds of interesting things, and then that comes back into the documentation as best practices. The third thing is the most interesting one that you said, which is, do you want to duplicate content from support in the technical documentation? Why would you duplicate documentation? That's the most ridiculous thing in the world, right? That's just copying and pasting. It's just duplicating stuff. And the worst part is that if the documentation moves on, but the support doesn't, or if the support moves on, but the documentation doesn't, you start to have inconsistencies. You don't want to duplicate documentation. Duplication is anathema. So, sorry, go ahead.
I was just going to ask, if you double it, doesn't it increase your SEO?
Well, having lots of articles saying my product is great, well, that's one way of doing SEO, but the best way of doing SEO is by having one article that says one thing and having lots of people hit it. That's what makes an amazing SEO. So duplicating has the inherent risk, the inherent danger of a lack of consistency, a lack of synchronicity, and that's very dangerous. So what we try to talk about instead is surfacing the content of one together with the other, not duplicating it. So that support articles are support articles. They have a role, an important role. They're written by support people for reactive content, as we said, okay? You have documentation, that's your 0-day content, that's written a priori. Sometimes best practices come into your documentation, but otherwise your troubleshooting documentation, it may have different access rights, as I said, because people like to keep support behind a login in case competitors see weaknesses. And I think also having this distinction between these two, I think it's correct. It's just that the content needs to be surfaced together. So that one search brings up both. And then if I have a problem, I can see the problem. If I want to see the 0-day content, I can see the 0-day content. And the two should be able to live side by side quite happily. Okay, you don't want to have duplication. That would, I think, be quite catastrophic in the long term. Okay, does that make sense?
Of course. Thank you so much.
Sure, you're welcome. Any other questions?
Well, this is more of a collaboration question than a, the technology behind it all. But suppose your support team and your documentation team report to different organizations. And, how do you go about syncing that up and really saying who owns what?
Exactly. That's exactly right. And this is a very common issue. So when you have support, I mean, it does happen that sometimes documentation and support go hand in hand, report to the same managers. Most of the time, documentation can be wandering in different parts of the organization, and it's really any guess where they report to. But having those two organizations completely separate, hardly speaking to each other, is why you have this problem in the first place. It's why we made this presentation in the first place, because it's two very different types of content, two very different types of people who are writing the content for very different reasons, for very different use cases. And so having these two speaking the same language is, of course, a little bit important, but having all that content surface together, that's where the gold is, we believe. So being able to have a single search box, wherever it is, if it's in the documentation portal, or if it's in your knowledge base site, or if it's in your community site, shouldn't really matter. Wherever I am, I need to be able to get answers to my questions. And that's what we believe is the key to a really good user experience. It's being able to ask my question wherever I am and have the content surface from any of those places. Does that make sense? Great. Any other questions from anyone?
Yeah, I'm sorry for joining late. I was torn between this and another presentation, and the other presentation was having technical difficulties, so here I am.
I thought it was my good looks. Go ahead.
Well, it's perfectly true that if we're talking about support writing KBs and somebody like in our company, InfoDev, writing docs, you're absolutely right. The two organizations don't talk to each other about this. In fact, we're separated organizationally up at a very high level. We're under design, and support is, well, under support. So you have to go up practically to the CEO to find a common manager.
Right.
I'll try not to babble too much. Our orgs are not in contact, but I am in contact with the chief technical support engineer. We have a very fine chats complaining how the rest of the world are idiots. And okay, the problem, one thing is, at least in our company, support are pushed to write KBs. They have a target. It's one of their performance targets is how many KB articles have you written? This results in a lot of KB articles. Then the quality of these KB articles is highly variable, shall we say, because there's no control. There's absolutely no, and I don't just mean the writing quality, which never mind the writing quality. I mean, the technical quality is not necessarily under control. So we have a problem there. And that leads into a general issue that what's in the docs is official, meaning our company is legally liable for what we say in documentation. If we say something wrong in documentation, we can and have been sued. So we want a bold line between. It would be lovely if these things are all findable. Sadly, we have a completely different system for KB and for doc. But if we have even a common search, we have to have red lines distinguishing. This is the official doc. Go here and see the less official public support. go here and search the really totally official, because it's submitted by people outside the company, community articles. And I wondered if you had seen that or managed that, or...
Right. Okay. Well, first of all, thank you, Jeff. You've put a lot into your question, so we'll try to again unpick this and see what comes out from this sandwich. Okay. So you started by saying that your company has set a goal where people are measured by the number of knowledge base articles that are being written. So
Yes.
your company has set forth a goal that says that the amount of content, that more is better. Okay.
Yes.
They probably set that at a time when there was hardly any, and it didn't look very good. And so they decided that more is better and they need to have more knowledge base articles. Understood. And as you quite rightly point out, just having a goal based on a number of number of articles being produced is a goal that will quickly run into problems because of its loopholes. Because suddenly people, if I write 2 articles that are almost the same, I'll get rewarded for it, right? So it's not quite a great goal in and of itself. Measuring quantity of knowledge articles and rewarding people for more is a poorly structured goal from a point of view of being effective. Now, it might be effective in the short term, and you just want to get a ton of knowledge out there, and so you are doing this very simple measurement. But after a while, I think it'll become very clear that people really do need to have more sophisticated goals. So that's the first thing. So more is obviously not necessarily better unless you have hardly any. So that's the first point. And the second point, of course, is one of review. So depending on the goals of the organization, I don't want to knock anyone. I don't know who the people are involved, and maybe they're also on this call, so I don't want to say anything. But overall, anything that is published needs to be reviewed. That happens in marketing, that happens in technical writing, and it should also happen with support. Why? Because as you quite rightly said, and as I said earlier to the previous question, you don't pick up something from a company site and think, oh, this was just written by support, whereas this was written by product. No, you don't think of the teams, you think of the company. This is company documentation. The fact that it was written by a support person doesn't make it any less company documentation. Once it's published on the site, it is the company talking, and therefore must go through rigorous reviews just like everyone else. If they don't do that, that is definitely a shortcoming, regardless of the goal. It must go through review. And then finally, having content which is duplicative. Okay, so when you duplicate content, then as I said in the previous question, you run a huge risk. And that risk is that you'll update one, but you won't update the others. And so you'll have problems of synchronicity, of consistency. Now, problems of consistency are not just for perfectionists like me. That has a real impact. If your content isn't consistent, then it has a real material impact, because you end up contradicting yourself. And when you contradict yourself, you undermine your legitimacy. You undermine your trustworthiness. You remove the whole purpose that you were writing in the first place, which is trust me, don't call support, trust me, I'm writing this, so you don't need to call support. But if I write one thing and then I write its opposite, then I have undermined my own trustworthiness and I'm forcing you to call support, and therefore I may as well not have written anything. Right? So consistency is materially important. Having duplicative content is anathema. It's a disaster waiting to happen. It's like a powder keg. So what you're left with is this goal of more content is better, and that is a questionable goal. So I would say write content. Support people should be writing reactive content. Technical writers should be writing zero-day content, okay, preemptive content. Those two do have a place. They are very important. It shouldn't be unified in any meaningful way, except on the user experience side, because for customers who are consuming this content, nobody cares. Nobody cares who wrote it. Everybody just wants an answer, right?
Yep.
That makes sense?
Yes. By the way, I just confirmed with said technical support engineer that in fact we have no consistency for review across KBs in support, because I wanted to be sure I was saying it fairly.
Right. It is a dangerous path to go down. So anybody who writes and publishes, you know, shoots from the hip, is endangering it. It's thin ice. It's thin ice. You know,
We have a review process. It's just not consistent or centralized. It's very much who is doing the review, and they're doing it however they want to do it.
Right. So centralized and consistent are two separate things, of course. Just like,
Yeah.
you know, writing departments can be all over the world, but they should have one consistent style guide, right? So in exactly the same way, the reviews need to be, you know, they don't need to be centralized, but they do need to be consistent. And then the purpose of this whole thing is surfacing it all together so that when a customer asks a question, then they could get the answer either in the proper documentation or in the proper support channels. Those two are equally proper and equally official. And it's important for people to understand that you can't sit in one part of the organization and say, oh, well, you know, you can't do that, because from a customer point of view, you don't have that luxury. The customers are seeing you all the same anyway.
Yep.
Okay?
Yep.
Great. Thank you. Thanks very much. Great question.
Yeah. I'll let someone else talk now.
Well, I was going to keep playing off of Jeff's question. I mean, it seems like he gets that, and maybe his fellow tech support person gets that, but how do you get the CEO to get it? Or however high you have to go in his organization.
Right. Right. So this is obviously making the case for consistency, making the case for what would happen if things don't pan out. So explaining to the CEO or to any executive that consistency matters, they don't care. Explaining to them that if you're not consistent, then you may as well not have invested in all of this writing, that self-service has gone down the drain, because now you're contradicting yourself. You're reducing not the legitimacy, but the reliability, the trustworthiness of your content. This is huge. The whole reason that we are in the enterprise of writing in the first place is to help people serve themselves, right? Otherwise, everybody will be calling support day and night. So the idea of not having this consistency, if you're going to explain it to a senior executive, you have to explain it in terms of money. And it's a very simple equation. You reduce the trustworthiness, you may as well not have it. I've had it myself with large organizations where I was working in a previous company on the back end of Windows. So some really, really deep level monitoring of the different types of timers that Windows starts and stops in order to measure the efficiency of Windows. And you go to different parts of the Microsoft website and you see different definitions of the same thing. So of course, what did we do? We had to call support, because you don't know what to believe. You have to in the end. So it's not just a thing to say, it's real. You don't trust if things are contradictory. You have to, you know, only one of them can be right. So you need to clarify. So that's how that works. Yeah. Any other questions from anyone?
So we have a couple different organizations represented in the audience here, because I have that luxury of looking you up and seeing where you're from. But is anybody getting this, doing this right, that's on the call, and maybe share some of your success of how you got to that point?
I'm actually from the same company as Jeff, from ServiceNow. And so I share the same pains. What we're trying to do in my doc set, because it's a very large writing team, so we're on different writing teams. So we try to handpick relevant KB articles and provide links from inside the documentation, wherever relevant, so that if somebody is already reading something and finds that it's not technical enough, it's not answering all the questions, or it doesn't go into some advanced configuration, because clearly we want to keep it very general level in the documentation, right? Answer the so we do provide the relevant KB article link right there. So trying to keep them on the same page, not to say on the same page, but try not to send them, you know, around looking for more information. Of course, compared to the whole pool of KB articles, that would be a tiny % that we use in the doc set. But this is what we were trying to do to help the users again, you know, kind of point them where we can. So if anybody wants to provide an opinion on that approach or share their experience, I would be very interested.
I'll chime in a second, but does anybody else have an opinion about this? So when we have different silos, but what we have is, and each silo has a search that just has a scope for its own area, then the best that you can do is enter a link in one to point to the other, that maybe this one is relevant to that one. And that is one way of working, of course. It's a bit like related links, where you can say, you might find this interesting, you might find that interesting. But we, as I said, we feel that probably the future has to be some kind of unified approach, that when people ask a question, they don't really care where this content is written. They don't care who it was written by. They don't even care why it was written. They just want their answer. And their answer to their question could be in any one of these three places. And that's why we feel that people who usually end up going to a support site, for example, should be able to find documentation there too, answers to documentation right there, right then. Okay, if people are used to going to a documentation portal, they should be able to find answers right there, right then, even if some of those answers are from the KB. I think that's reasonable. When we step outside our offices and we go home and we are consumers again and we aren't authors, that's exactly what we expect. We expect for people to go in. We expect to be able to go into a company website from HP, for example, if I've got a printer at home and it's not working. Do I care? Do I care if it was written by a technical writer or if it was written by a support person? I just want an answer to my question. Or if the answer is in a community, I'll take that. Okay, so the idea would be to be able to surface the answers that people need regardless. And finding a way for all of those to cohabit one alongside the other is, I think, extremely important. And not having people move or switch contexts so that I'm hearing one thing with one set of, it's almost like a thought paradigm where you have all of your menus and your sidebars and so on, and then to have to switch to another one and it's a completely different way of thinking and a completely different way of searching, and So everybody wants to be able to be in their site. They want to be able to see the answers where they are with a minimum of fuss, with a minimum of disruption, and then to get on with their day. Again, this is something else that people very rarely appreciate, which is that people are not waiting for you're not the center of their existence. Your answer isn't the center of their existence. They have a job to do. They've had to come to your page in order to get their answer, right? They're not there look for your thing and then, oh, let's look for more because it's so interesting. They are just there in order to get their job done, and they have to get an answer from you. So we just want to offer it with a minimum of fuss so that they can get on with their lives. That's what we want to be able to do, I think. That's what would give a great user experience when it comes to documentation or KB articles or crowdsourcing content. It's really the same. Thank you.
Thank you.
Oh, sorry excuse me for piping up again, but I don't know if you really touched on the last point I made, which is that these different sources have different levels of reliability and we have different levels of legal liability for them. So we still need to have some kind of, you know, if you go to community, this might not work.
Right. So you're quite right. Thank you. So yes, I did touch on it a little bit, but there is one important point which you mentioned, which I believe is true, which is that you can't present all of the content entirely identically the same. It probably bears mentioning that this is a community article. It probably bears mentioning that this is not a community article, because a community article might work or might not. You know, putting your iPhone in the freezer after, you know, you can try it if you like, but that's not our official policy, right? So that kind of thing is probably very important. So, for example, where I work now at Zoomin, what we have is a solution where when you bring forth articles that are community or articles that are knowledge articles or articles that are from documentation, they are clearly identified as such. They're formatted in the same way. They are presented in the same way within the same context, but I think it is important, you're absolutely right, that there is a different level of liability when it comes to a crowdsourced suggestion that could be completely loopy. So it's important to get that right. And you may even have different legal statements in the footer for each one if you want. So that kind of thing is probably very helpful as well. Yes, yes, I agree. Any other questions? Everyone is very shy. Anything?
Sounded like Priya was on a train, maybe. Boom, 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 boom. That was there for a minute. Yeah.
Okay. Okay.
So no questions? What about comments or anything else that somewhat related to the topic? We're going to be here for another 20 minutes, so we've got a couple of folks from Zoomin on the line. So if you have questions about their tool, we can certainly take those now too. Or we could just say how beautiful Israel is. where Lawrence is. When I had the pleasure of putting together that intro slide for the keynote, and I was putting in the different towns from folks that are in Israel. I was like amazed at how pretty it is. The coastlines that you guys have.
Yeah,
That's really nice.
yeah, we're very fortunate. Right now, it's a horrible, never-ending heat wave that has been going on for several weeks. But it's about to break, I think, and the winds of change. You can start to feel that now. Yes.
Yeah.
Yes.
Not that we need
down
to.
here in, sorry.
Yes.
Go ahead.
Now, I was just going to say that down here in Pune, we are having a lot of rain. So it's crazy. It gets hot during the mornings and then it rains like crazy, very zero visibility.
Wow.
Quite a contrast to where Israel is right now.
Yeah. That's very different. Excellent.
Okay. Quite a good
Alright.
group.
Can you go for it, Joe?
No, got Julia.
I was wondering if you can speak a little bit more to the kind of workarounds that you see customers take in order to bring KVs and documentation together. Like, what are the kind of faux pas that you're seeing and the consequences? I mean, I know you touched upon it in your presentation, but maybe you can use some more specific examples of the limited approaches that people are taking.
Oh, I've seen workarounds that would bring tears to your eyes. Really, I mean, I have seen people actually physically do copying and pasting from one format into another. Really, people being hired just to do copying and pasting from one source format into another format because they have such a fragmented experience. So of course this is, and of course they end up speaking to us because this is a highly inefficient way of working. It's a very difficult approach to for customers, of course, and things get out of sync very quickly. So it has to be a coordinated approach. So while support people are in their world doing their thing with their tools, which is fine, and that's what they should be doing, and the documentation people are in their world doing their thing with their tools, which is fine, and perhaps sometimes you have these best practices that are coming across from support to the documentation, but otherwise it's really very much everybody in their world. There has to be somebody who sits on top of all of these very myopic views, who can bring it all together into a cohesive corporate picture. Because somebody's got to be thinking of the customer at the end of the day. Somebody's got to be thinking about what this all looks like. I've spoken to, even before I joined Zoomin, when I was working in technical writing, I was approaching the senior management of the companies I was working with in a simple presentation where I basically just showed them what it's like to try to use our website. I was in the company at the time, it was our website, just show them this is what it's like to go into our website as a customer and to try to find an answer. And I would take them through, and you would see these managers, they were kind of holding their heads in shame as they were looking at this, literally hurdle after hurdle that you would have to make people jump through just to get an answer to their question. It was shameful in a way. And once they see that, they understand that, because everybody is so in their creator mode, they're in their authoring mode, they're in their, we have to get our delivery out and so on. And almost, once it's out, it's off my radar. I'm not thinking about it anymore. It's off my scope. And people who are in these departments don't have this higher picture. So very often now with Zoomin, for example, we have a bit of an odd problem, because we talk to the people who are in these roles, in these organizations that are doing their thing, if they're authoring or if they're writing support or taking whatever it is that, the calls that they're taking. But we also need to speak to somebody who has the breadth and the vision to be able to see beyond any one department, and to be able to look on a global scale and say, what is the customer experience like? Pretend to be a customer for a minute and try to find an answer. What do? You go to Google, you try to do it. So for example, Jeff, you mentioned that you're with ServiceNow and a couple of others also. So with ServiceNow, I've tried it myself. I go to Google and I type something in and see what happens, right? That's what most people would do. And the nice thing is that you have several entries. The first entries that come up are for the appropriate content. If you're writing content that's a little bit more, if your query is a little bit more technical, you'll get the technical documentation. If it's a little bit more general, you'll get the marketing documentation, which is great. It's exactly the way it should be. But having this, I would call it almost just a realignment of saying, hang on a second, what are we doing this for? We're doing this for customers. So let's all pretend to be a customer for a minute. Let's try this. Let's go into a site, type something in, see what happens. How easy or how difficult are you making it for people to find their answers? This is really the key. And I think having that realignment can be a very useful way of doing things. Yes.
Lawrence, I have a question, maybe a leading question, but so you talked a little bit about going reaching across different parts of the organization to create that better customer experience. So let's say we have like different tools being run by different parts of the organization. Let's say for example, I know we're having documentation in one place. We have like we have articles being written maybe by support or customer experience, either like in Salesforce or MindTouch, or something like this. And then can you talk a little bit? I know you have a session on Wednesday about business value and analytics. So can you touch on how someone can express the value for this customer experience across different parts of the organization? I mean, how to get consensus around people in the company and how they can increase their ROI, their KPIs for the different parts of the organization for this customer experience. I mean,
right.
Customer experience is nice, but nice usually needs to translate into business value and dollars, euros, whatever your chosen currency is.
Yes.
So can you talk a little bit about how we can translate this how can someone translate this into business value for other parts of the organization?
Of course, it's a great question. Thank you. So being able to surface content, you're right. Customer experience. It's a very lofty goal, but it's not the goal. The goal has to be making sure that the company is keeping customers, making sure it's not losing customers, and making sure that we are saving money by not having everybody turn to support, but instead getting their answers self-served, right? That's one of the main reasons to write content. So how can you tell when documentation is effective? Okay, and effective documentation, of course, can be lots of different things. Like Jeff said, it has to be high quality and it has to be accurate and so on and so forth. But effective documentation also has to be used, right? If you have the great quality documentation but nobody's using it, not so effective, right? If you are using the documentation but still calling support, also not effective, right? So the goal of content has to be crystal clear. And the goals are really what determines how effective the effectiveness, the way that you measure the effectiveness of your content. So if you have a goal that says the purpose of writing content is to reduce support, then you have to look. You have to say, okay, this is before I have this content up. This is after I have this content up. Now, how many questions on support did I get about this subject? Has it changed? Okay, or as we speak in the whole analytics world, has it moved the needle at all? Have I actually made an impact, an effective impact in the presence of my documentation? So this is of course extremely important. So when you're looking at the different types of tools that you have, and you're looking, for example, at knowledge articles, and you're looking, for example, at documentation portals and so on. You've got all of these different places that people might be looking for their answers. So you type a search in the knowledge base site, and you type it in the documentation site. There has to be a place where all these search queries come together and are measured together so that we can have an overall picture.
Can those
and
search
we
queries,
have to make, sorry, go on.
sorry, Bertrand, can those search queries come from like a front-end portal, let's say I have a front-end marketing site, someone comes to my marketing, they comes to my .com site and they get to my product page or something, they want to find information. Can that search be coming from my front-end portal page, or do I need to direct the person all the way to a KB site or a documentation portal? Because a lot of companies, they have, there's front-end sites are being driven by, or the web team, they're running their site on AEM or something like that, or Sitecore,
Right. Exactly.
and they want to say, wait a minute, they think they can be able to serve up all this content also. So the question is, how can we, is that a possibility, and somehow collaborate with a web team who owns the corporate site, who's used to building marketing pages, and how can we help them to deliver service pages or support pages and documentation pages?
Exactly. Nice question. Thank you. So all of these tools that build these corporate websites, these digital asset managers like Adobe Experience Manager and all of these other things, there has been in the past, I think, a separation to say that the corporate site has just marketing content, and the documentation site has just documentation, and the support site has just support content. But of course, now we're seeing a crossover and a merging of these different types of content. It's absolutely true. So you're starting to see a blurring of these lines. And we've seen, for example, these PDPs, these product description pages that sit on websites. Okay, so you go to HP, for example, and you're looking at a printer page. Now, when it shows all of the requirements, when it shows how to set, why would you have all of the technical details of that product somewhere else? Put it here in the product description page. That's where it belongs. And when I do a search on my website, have all the answers there, all the answers there. So this blurring of lines between different types of content is happening everywhere. And you're absolutely right, Joe, to bring this up, that it's not just proactive, reactive, and crowdsourced content. It's also marketing content. Same deal. It's all the voice of the company. Wherever I am, I should be able to access my answer, whatever it is that I'm looking for, and be able to see all the ancillary information right there. So while different departments are using their tools to create this, in the end, the user experience should be that the content floats into these product description pages or any other kind of page that you're on, and be able to see the content that is related from wherever it came. That's what gives the user experience. That's what helps people find the answers that they need. That's what helps reduce the support. And you can see this with analytics. You can see the cost of support, whether or not people were about to open a support call, but they were taken off to a product page or a documentation page in order to find their answer. That's money saved, okay, because it's self-service. So all of these things need to be measured, and then they can be collated in reports and passed up. Now, of course, the people doing the measuring have to know what they're measuring, right? And they have to be able to choose those measurements carefully in order to make a case that is very clear monetary value. The monetary value of bringing together content from disparate sources and having it presented in one coherent and cohesive picture. That's right. Absolutely. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you for the answer.
Turns out we're close to the 5-minute mark, so I just need to announce that. So get those last-minute questions on. Not that Lawrence won't be around for the rest of the event here, and including Joe as well from Zoomin. So.
Right. I should mention that we do have a Slack channel, which is VE for vendor -Zoomin, which is part of the Convex Slack experience. So if you go in there, you can reach me anytime, and I'll be very happy to answer questions on that channel, or indeed privately as well. Very happy to do that. Thank you.
Thank you, Lawrence.
Welcome. Very good. Very good. Extremely helpful.
And I should add that we have a test kitchen at, I think, 9 a.m. Eastern. I'm looking at my Israel calendar, so I've got to make sure I'm making that switch correctly, where Joe is going to be co-presenting with Rick Teplitz from Imperva, and I believe touching on some of the issues that were raised in this conversation today. So I really encourage you guys to head on over to watch that.
I'll be sure to ask tough questions there too.
I'm going to put you on mute.
Payback.
What time is that Central Time? What time is that? Is Central European Time?
Central European Time. It's 3.
3. Okay, great. Cool. Great. Okay, thanks very much, Lawrence.
All right, great. Well, thank you very much, everyone, for attending and for asking your questions. I appreciate it very much. And like I said, feel free to reach out if you want to continue the conversation at any time, okay?
Great, thanks.
Great, thanks very much, everyone.
Thanks, Lawrence. Hey, you're not off the hook yet. We still have 4 minutes. Someone may pop in from another room. We're not allowed to let you go just yet.
Okay.
Well, I could mention the slight problem we have that all of our KB articles are sitting on our own platform, which is to say on an instance, on there's one administration instance we call high that customers, not everyone at the customer site, but admins on the customer site have access to. It's where all our KB, our publicly available KB lives. And it's not all that publicly available. You can't Google it, and you can't get in without a high log on. So it makes any kind of integration really problematic. Even making cross-platform search is really problematic.
Well, this is where tools can both be a problem and can both transcend a problem. It depends how you look at it. So having a separate tool is a problem, but it's absolutely not insurmountable. So there are ways that you can bring tools together, to have them speak to each other and to have them surface content from one into the other. Lots of ways of doing it. There are search federation tools that allow you to do this. There are periodic indexes that allow you to pull things in. You could even auto-upload content from one site into another. So having different tools, I think, is reasonable because that's history. Okay, this department grew up with this tool, and it's right to have a tool that fits your purpose. Just because you have a tool that's doing that serves you, it doesn't mean everybody else should use that same tool. But then what happens is that you end up growing different worlds, and you don't want that. You want to be able to unify them together. But the unification doesn't have to happen behind the scenes. It has to happen at the level of the customer experience. This is really where people can self-serve effectively. And that's where tools working together and talking to people who understand those tools and can offer solutions to allow those tools to talk to each other, that's where the real value can come in, I think. And this is probably very, very useful. Okay. Thanks very much for your questions, Jeff. I appreciate it very much. And thank you all for attending.
Thanks, Lawrence.
Very nice. All right. All right.
Have a great rest of your day, and we'll see you virtually in another room, maybe. And
Will
just
do,
to
will do.
remind everybody,